Rand at 2033. Thank you so much for staying with South Africa tonight. We look at this now. School violence remains a growing concern across South Africa, with incidents of bullying, assaults and weapons on school premises continuing to make headlines. Education stakeholders, parents and community leaders are calling for stronger safety measures to create a safe learning environment. To discuss this further, we're joined by Dr Gerard Labuschagne, who's a threat assessment specialist. Thank you so much for your time this evening and welcome to eNCA. I think let's start by looking at a recent case, which is the matter of the Pretoria Boys High School pupil who promised to, quote-unquote, blow up his school and even bring a Glock to school. Now, unfortunately, the Department of Education is at odds with the school's measures to expel the boy. But just talk us through whether this is indicative of the general trend of school violence in South Africa. Is it this aggressive? Is it this, quite frankly, scary?
Thanks. Of course, I don't know the finer details of the Pretoria Boys High case, just beyond what's in the news. So obviously, sure, I can't get too much into details as to whether it's the right or wrong decision. But I think we also have to look at it as, are we making things worse? Taking extreme steps like expelling people actually is not a safety decision. And I think this is where we have to split up between what's a disciplinary response, what might be a policing response if the circumstances require it. But none of those have anything to do with keeping people safe. You kick someone out of your school, they are potentially more of a risk to you than before you kick them out of the school. So we have a mindset, unfortunately, in South Africa, and we saw this back in 2024 at the Primrose Elementary School in Johannesburg. If you look at the news inserts, from the community to the politicians, we're all talking about more punishment, harsher consequences for kids who do anything wrong, bring back corporal punishment, and none of those are aimed at actually keeping people safe. It's an emotional response, and I can understand why a lot of people feel that way, but that's not got anything to do with safety.
So
we also have, unfortunately, in South Africa, because of well, firstly, which we don't have, because we don't change in South Africa. We had this exact same conversations back in 2024 with the Primrose case, and when we had the Nick Deirdrick's case at the so-called school sword killer back in 2006. Same conversations, but nothing's changed. So the solution, really, if you look at what's done internationally, is to actually train people in the school environment, a small group of people, educators, admin staff, if there's a school counselor, fantastic, to actually be able to do threat assessments or violence risk assessments. Those are not the domain of psychology. Those are typically done by people who are not psychologists, but have been trained in understanding and assessing threatening behavior. There's a saying that we have that you can't connect the dots unless you collect the dots. So unless someone's received a concern, in this case, it might be a threat, it might be an email, it might be an essay a kid has written for English that is very violent in nature, or there's some other behavior that's raised concern, that needs to go to that group of people who then do a thorough assessment of the scenario, gather further information, and then do a violence risk assessment to determine, is this just a kid who made an offhand inappropriate comment and we just need to educate them that this is not appropriate? Or is this a kid who's on the pathway to actually acting this behavior out? And of course, then we have to have an appropriate response. But it's not a case of we picked up a problem or just send them off to the psychologist. If in your environment you're lucky enough to have one, or the school has one, etc., which most schools don't. Psychologists aren't actually trained, and I'm saying this as a clinical psychologist myself, psychologists aren't typically trained in assessing violent behavior risk. We're trained to assess people diagnostically, but a violence risk is not a diagnostic assessment. It's to determine whether someone's engaged violently.
So what are the interventions that then come into play? Because unfortunately, in the South African context, we are also not necessarily resource-rich education environment. So there's that needs to be considered. But all things, blue sky scenario, as you've just painted, what would then be done with a child who has been assessed to actually be a security risk within the school environment?
So obviously a proper assessment of the risk factors would tell us what do we need to target. So if there's substance issues, we need to target that. If there's attitudes that say that person has, that violence is acceptable solution, we need to target that through some form of counseling or psychology, of course. So we look at what the risk factors are, and we try and remove as many of those risk factors through various means. A lot of kids who engage ultimately in violent acts in the school environment, specifically mass violence attacks, add the sense of isolation and feelings of rejection. So we really need to combat that type of feeling and those sense that they have. So again, it is some support that we give the person. It might be sort of therapy by a professional. We're looking at their substance issues, are there problems at home. So it is going to be intense involvement. But what are the consequences if we don't do this? So if people say, oh, this is going to cost some money, I can guarantee you, I can promise you, if something of a violent nature happens at a school and there were warning signs and the school didn't do something, it's going to cost them a lot more money than it would be to repurpose. And I'm not saying employ people. You can take people that are already in schools. If you look at workplaces that have violence risk assessment teams, it's not employing 5 or 10 people to do that. You're taking existing people from HR, if there's wellness counseling, administrators, and you're training them to do this as a secondary function. So the training might cost you some money, but it's already people that are in your environment that you can use.
Sure. Let's consider the well-being and the security of the rest of the children, even the teachers in that school. In this particular case, as we've said, we've read the media reports. You don't know the particular details. This young person made it clear, spread the word on WhatsApp, and made it clear that it was known by his fellow schoolmates that he desired to do these things, blow up a school or bring a gun to school, irrespective of whether or not he was going to follow through. What then happens with the security and well-being of the rest of the school community?
Well, of course, we can never make a decision just based on what he said. There has to be a proper look, again, come back to a proper violence risk assessment to determine, had this person started to make steps towards that, of actually acting this out? Is this just behavior for whatever reasons to get attention, but there's no intention to follow through? The only way you're going to get that answer is doing a proper violence risk assessment. And a police investigation isn't a violence risk assessment. A disciplinary investigation isn't a violence risk assessment. Those are completely different things for different purposes. So that's the only way we're going to know whether there's some genuine concern that this person was on a pathway to act it out. And of course, people's safety is the primary. So yeah, having the person perhaps not coming to school until we've done a proper assessment of the scenario is an appropriate step. But just having them off school because we don't know what else to do with them, that's not keeping people safe. We've got countless examples of people who have been expelled or fired from a workplace and then come back afterwards and engage in a violent act. So you're not keeping someone safe by expelling them. I heard there were, for example, plans to let him come to write his exams at school. Well, I think until we've done a proper risk assessment, that's very irresponsible.
Sure.
And also, for example, are you going to let him write with the other kids? Now, it's unfair on those kids if they're fearing this person sitting next to them in the classroom, they're not focusing on their exams. So I do think the kid should be allowed to continue with his academic program. It might not be coming to school every day, and it might not be writing exams during the normal school hours. It might be after hours. It might, until we know what the risk of this person is. Because if there's low risk and it's just inappropriate comments, we need to get the person back into the school environment as soon as possible. If there's a concern, for genuine concern, after you've done an assessment, then we have to take the necessary interventions to try and help this person to make it safe for them one day to go back to school or whatever the decision might be.
Should we be worried or thinking differently about the interplay of social media or technology like phones and the ability to record instances of humiliation or violence with people or pupils or learners not wanting to intervene but to record instead? It seems perhaps, anecdotally, the bystander effect has just increased exponentially.
Yeah, so those types of things can be good and bad. They're good in the sense that people often communicate their intentions via things. The Primrose School case in 2024, the kid was communicating on a group of people before the shooting what he's going to do. So, and that's what happened in 2006 with the Nick Dietrich's sword killer case. He was telling people what he's going to do and sending text messages to people. So that's what we call leakage. And that's incredibly common in school violence cases, that there was information beforehand. It just didn't come to the right people's attention until it was too late or things got so serious. So that's a wonderful opportunity for us to get and find out about things and inform people that you really need to bring that to our attention so we can look and make the decision whether or not there's some seriousness behind this.
All right.
On the other hand, what you were saying, of course, is this public humiliation of people. Of course, if someone has got possibly violent intentional thoughts and they're being publicly humiliated and rejected and not being part of the community that they're involved in, yeah, that's never helpful. It just can exacerbate the level of rejection and isolation that a kid feels. Sure. So those types of things are a plus and a con because it helps us perhaps pick it up sooner, but it's also a method by which people can harass other individuals and which pushes them further down that pathway.
All right, thank you so much for your time. We'll leave it there for today. That was Dr Gerard Labuschagne.